I spent the majority of this past week in Orlando, Florida, not at Disney World, but at an international leadership conference. For almost 20 years, I have been reading and studying the books of John Maxwell, and a while back I made the decision to go through his certification program to become a certified speaker, coach, trainer, really to sharpen my own skills. And so I was in Orlando this week, and we talked about a lot of things. We talked about priorities. We talked about personal growth. We talked about developing a positive attitude. We talked about balance. And so I'm going to try my best to incorporate these different components into my work here at Woodmont. But years ago, I bought into Stephen Covey's concept of sharpening the saw. Do you remember Stephen Covey wrote that book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? And the first one was be proactive. The second habit was begin with the end in mind. The third was put first things first. The fourth was think win-win. Fifth, seek first to understand, then to be understood. The sixth was synergize, and the seventh was sharpen the saw. And so I do everything that I can, and I would challenge you to do everything that you can to grow in your own life, to sharpen the saw on a regular basis, because I think all of us need to be refueled, we need to be recharged, and we need to keep growing every single day of our lives. And so this week was very helpful for me in doing that. But I don't know how many of you have heard of John Maxwell, but I thought I'd put a couple of his well-known quotes out there to begin this morning. Maxwell says, "A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way." He said, "Sometimes you win, and sometimes you learn. People hear your words, but they feel your attitude. You cannot lead others until you first learn to lead yourself." And he says, "Your life will be summarized in one sentence. So go ahead and choose it now, or it'll be chosen for you." I'd recommend any of his books to you, and it was a great experience for me. Today, we move ahead in Mark's Gospel. We've been studying Mark's Gospel during the season of Lent, and today we move ahead to chapter 8, which I believe is a pivotal chapter in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus says to his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." I think this just might be the central theme of Mark's gospel. If you're looking to discover what this gospel is all about, the challenge of discipleship, the difficulty of following Jesus, is probably the first thing that jumps out at me, and this passage sums that up. Today I want to talk about 3 concepts, and I'm going to talk about them in order. The first is self-care, the second is self-absorption, and the third is self-denial. So first, self-care. In the Christian tradition, we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of serving others. We talk a lot about giving and sacrificing, mission and service, outreach, looking out for others, putting others first. We do this because it's what Jesus calls us to do, to love our neighbor as ourselves. But before we can love our neighbor as ourselves, we first need to love ourselves in a healthy way. Before I can be a good pastor and pour out into others, I first must learn to take care of myself. We live in a world that is very busy, very stressful, and very loud. We live in a world where many of us work too hard and we multitask, and we often neglect the people and the things that should matter the most to us. And sometimes that includes a tendency to neglect our own needs. Some of us don't do a very good job of taking care of ourselves. I believe that all of us, no matter who we are, have 4 basic areas that we need to tend to when it comes to self-care. And I'm going to mention these. The first one is our physical needs. The second, emotional needs. The third, intellectual needs. And the fourth, spiritual needs. So first, physical needs. And this is one of those where I can say, do as I say, not necessarily as I do. All of us know that we need air, water, food to stay alive, But also, we need a proper diet. We need plenty of sleep, exercise, if we're going to enjoy actually being alive. How often have you heard somebody say, I really don't know why, but I'm just tired all the time? I would dare say that the main cause of exhaustion in our society is not necessarily having too busy of a schedule, although that can be a problem, but it's not getting enough sleep, exercise, and maintaining a healthy diet. When people get depressed, one of the first things they should do is go to their doctor, have a checkup. And oftentimes what your doctor will tell you is you're not taking care of yourself. We all know that that's important, but sometimes we just don't do it. For example, why do so many of us see food as a source of entertainment and comfort rather than as an important source of energy and strength? Why do we wait until we are overweight and have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or wait until we suffer a heart attack or a stroke before we realize the importance of eating properly? A healthy and balanced diet along with regular exercise and plenty of sleep are the only ways to keep ourselves strong enough to cope with the troubles and the challenges that come our way in life. And so we have to tend to our physical needs. Next, we have emotional needs. Whether we want to admit it or not, probably our most important emotional need is to be accepted and loved by other people. As human beings, it's in our DNA. We're wired to have relationships with others where we feel like we belong. So we must choose carefully the company that we keep. We can survive in life without these relationships, but we simply cannot thrive. For most people, the main way that they meet this emotional need is by spending time with others, with their family, their friends, their spouses, significant others, colleagues at work or at church. And when we don't make the time to live our lives in a way that nurtures these relationships, and we can become emotionally unhealthy. Now, there are some people who have been hurt in life. They've been hurt in their marriage, they've been hurt in their relationships, and so they put up a wall because they don't want to be hurt again. And what happens is they isolate themselves and they don't invest time and energy into the relationships that feed their emotional needs. It's why in the church we talk about small groups, because we're all looking for an opportunity not just to connect with people, but to be able to share life with other people and to be able to share our challenges and our struggles and the things that we deal with on a regular basis. And we want to trust that we can share that with others and have other people share that with us, and we can gain support and strength as we journey through life, because life is hard. And sometimes we can't just make it by ourselves. We need to prop each other up and to help each other get through difficult situations. And let's be honest, the pace and the pressure of the modern world is often not that conducive to building these relationships. We live in a world of increasing individuality. I heard David Brooks once say that one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century is going to be social isolation, that people think they're connected, they pretend to be connected, but really they're not. And so all of us hunger for relationships and for connections to meet our emotional needs. Next, intellectual needs. Every single one of us needs to be growing intellectually. The ideas that we allow to enter our heads lead to our thoughts, which then lead to our actions. And so it's just as important that we have a diet of the mind, just like we have a diet of the body. Before I finished school, I can remember my father saying how unfortunate it is that we live in a culture where many people no longer have a love of learning. They ask, is it going to be on the test? And if it's not going to be on the test, then they say, well, then why do I need to learn it? College students want to know, is it going to be on the test? And then after they pass the test and the class is over, they sell their books for $20 and they get on with it. We need to build a culture, a hunger for learning, and parents, one of the best ways that parents can do this is to model it for their children, that we have to challenge ourselves intellectually. Jesus said, love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The Apostle Paul said, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We have intellectual needs, and we have to satisfy those. And the fourth category is spiritual needs, and I think that this is perhaps the most important. It's been said before that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. Not necessarily human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. And sometimes that human experience is not all that fun. Sometimes when we're dealing with an illness, or we're dealing with depression, or we're dealing with cancer, we're spiritual beings trapped in a human experience. We have spiritual needs. God is always there, but many of us don't know it because we lose God in the noise and the busyness of the world. Remember what Pascal said. He said, so many of our problems all point back to the simple fact that we cannot sit alone and quiet in a room by ourselves. Now, of these four areas, I think the spiritual needs are perhaps the most important. Of course, you'd expect a preacher to say that, right? But if our spiritual needs are not being met, then all the other ones feel out of whack as well. We have to nurture all four of these if we want to take care of ourselves, if we want to do self-care. Now, I want to make a clear distinction this morning between self-care and self-absorption. Self-care is necessary and healthy. Self-absorption is not. Self-care must be a priority in our schedules. Self-absorption shows when it's gone too far. Self-care is not selfish. Self-absorption is. Self-care was modeled by Jesus. Self-absorption was not. Self-absorption could be defined as self-care that's gotten out of control, that's gone overboard. You know, we all live in a culture where we're taught from an early age to take care of ourselves, to look out for ourselves, to do well for ourselves. And many of the decisions that people make can be in their own best interest. And then we hear these words of Jesus, where he says, deny self. And we're not quite sure what to make of it. We're not quite sure what to do with it. In his book, With Love and Prayers, Tony Jarvis has a chapter that's titled Beyond Self-Absorption. And he says, life involves a continual temptation to return to self-absorption. He says there is a great tendency in all of us to withdraw into ourselves or into safe little cliques of like-minded people, to live sheltered, claustrophobic, risk-free, boring little lives. This is often our natural inclination as human beings. But Jarvis goes on to say in that chapter something about the Christian faith. He says the Christian faith calls us to involve ourselves in the lives of other people. It calls us to go against our natural innate tendencies of self-absorption. It calls us to care. It calls us not just to tolerate, not just to involve ourselves, but to actually love one another. Self-absorption, when it's all said and done, brings about unhappiness, but happiness, on the other hand, only comes from self-risk, inconvenient involvement, self-sacrifice, and love. And selfish and narcissistic people are usually not very happy people. If you interact with people on a regular basis, like I do in the ministry, and many of you do in your jobs and at your work, it usually doesn't take a long time to identify the people that are completely self-absorbed. These are the people that are not interested in listening, but only in talking. They're not interested in giving, but only in getting. They're not interested in how they can help others because they only want to know whether or not you can help them. And if you can help them, then they have no use for you. You become irrelevant. It's been said before that there's no smaller package in life than somebody who's all wrapped up in themselves. And I think that's true because selfish people, self-absorbed people are usually some of the most unhappy people in the world. But the challenge for us, I think, is to find the sacred balance between self-care, which is necessary, and self-absorption, which is a problem. I think self-denial happens somewhere in between. Jesus found it. Think about how often Jesus would go away to pray, and then he'd come back and pour himself into the ministry. But he could not do this if he was completely depleted. Just like us, he had to recharge. So let's talk about self-denial. If any want to become my followers, they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. I don't believe that denying self means that we fail to do self-care, because self-care is necessary, it's healthy, it's right. But denying self does not mean that we become self-absorbed and self-centered. The challenge is to find the balance. The challenge is to realize that just doing one or the other is not good enough. Just doing self-care and that's all, not good enough. Being self-absorbed, that's a problem. One of the keys to understanding this concept of self-denial is wrestling with this word humility. What does it mean to be humble? What does it mean to live a humble life? Andrew Murray once said this: humility is perfect quietness of heart. It is for me to have no trouble, never to be fretted or vexed or irritated or sore or disappointed. It is to expect nothing, to wonder at nothing that is done to me, to feel nothing done against me. It is to be at rest when nobody praises me and when I am blamed or despised. It is to have a blessed home in the Lord where I can go in and shut the door and kneel to my Father in secret and be at peace as in a deep sea of calmness when all around me is trouble. Humility keeps us from being selfish. Humility doesn't mean that we think less of ourselves. It just means that we think of ourselves less. Self-denial, I believe, is found somewhere between self-care and self-absorption, and it has a healthy dose of humility. A lot of what we talked about at the Maxwell conference this week has to do with valuing people. That's one of his core tenets, DNA, value people. But have you ever thought about the fact that we live in a culture where people often like to bring everything back to themselves? For example, somebody will say, I have 2 daughters, and somebody else will pipe up, well, I have 3 daughters. Somebody will say, oh, my daughter married a lawyer, and somebody chimes in, well, my daughter married a doctor. Somebody says, we went to Destin for spring break, and immediately somebody else jumps in, we went to the Bahamas. Somebody says, I just got a new Jeep Grand Cherokee is my car, I love it. And somebody says, well, I just got a new BMW X5. Why do we feel like we have to one-up each other all the time and bring the conversation back to ourselves? What would it look like if we learned to take a genuine interest in other people, listen to them, engage with them, and not bring it back to ourselves? That's a form of self-denial. Others. Focusing on others. That was one of Jesus' key words besides love. Love one another. I guess the message that I'm trying to get across this morning is that if self-care is on this end and it's necessary, and self-absorption is on this end and it's excessive, we're called to deny self, not neglect self, but deny self and live a life where we engage with and serve and love others. Amen.